A not-so-united kingdom where anger, violence and racism spilled out into the streets last month. The riots may have ended, but do minorities in the UK feel safe at home? I'm Anelise Borges, and this is The Stream.
This is our country, and we want it back!
Back from what? I'm not oppressed in this country.
Get him out of here!
We're saving the kids, we're stopping the boats, we're closing the borders. I'm not racist and I don't give a what you say.
They're calling us far right. We're not far right, we're all fathers and parents of children. These immigrants are coming in without paperwork, we're lying about their ages, we don't know nothing about the backgrounds, and that's what it's about.
If you want to make your country better and protect it, the best course of action is to smash everything up and then set random cars on fire. That really helps.
What does it mean to be British today? Who can call themselves that? Those are questions many in the UK are pondering after rioters burned and looted property while telling brown and black people to go back to where they came from, including those born and raised there. To unpack what's going on in the UK today, we're joined by Taj Ali, a historian of British South Asian political activism and co-editor of Tribune magazine, Ash Sarkar, a contributing editor at Novara Media, and Michael Morgan, the founder of WhoaTV and co-host of the podcast Why I'm No Longer Talking to Institutionally Racist Police. All three join us from London. Thank you so much for being part of the stream today. So a horrific crime happened. Some prominent social media users decides to invent a culprit, and here we are. Britain is faced with some of the most horrific riots in decades. Ash, where were you when these riots erupted, and what went through your mind when you started looking at these scenes?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the seeds of the rioting that we saw were planted earlier that weekend. So I'm based in London, and in London, just before those horrific stabbings in Southport, you had one of the biggest demonstrations that far-right activist Tommy Robinson had ever seen. He brought thousands of people into central London, and that kind of far-right street activity combined with social media misinformation, that was what drove those awful scenes that we saw initially in Southport and then spreading out across multiple sites across the country, including Middlesbrough, Hull, Tamworth and Rotherham. So being based in London, there wasn't much rioting in the areas where I lived. In fact, there were an awful lot of well-attended solidarity demonstrations. Where there was the most rioting activity, you actually had fairly small ethnic minority populations. You didn't have big, well-established ones, but you did have asylum seekers staying in hotels, and you did have small Muslim communities who found themselves under attack.
But how did it make you feel? Did you still feel as though there's something profoundly wrong happening in your country?
Oh, of course. I don't think anyone could look at the sites of both racist rioting, racist attacks, racist graffiti, attacks on asylum seekers without thinking that something's gone deeply, deeply wrong. By virtue of my job, I've become a hate figure for the far right. I had personal concerns for my safety, and I was worried that the scenes that we saw in Rotherham and Tamworth, where rioters attempted to set fire to hotels with asylum seekers inside, people who've escaped persecution, people who've escaped war, that somebody would die. I was genuinely very, very concerned about that. And I imagine lots of other people were too.
Absolutely. Taj, we spoke about this before the show, and you actually said that this hatred has been brewing for a long time. Can you help unpack this for our viewers? What do you mean by that?
I think for many, many years now, the British Muslim community in particular have been demonized by politicians and much of the British press. You only have to look at when Israel started bombing Gaza in October, some of the narratives we were getting. So we had the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, talking about hate marchers. And then we had these conspiracy theories about Islamists taking over the country. And that was fueled by inflammatory newspaper headlines about pro-Palestinian marchers and Muslims standing up for their rights or partaking in the democratic process. Then you have Nigel Farage, the leader of the far-right Reform Party, saying British Muslims don't have British values on national television. So as much as we talk about misinformation and far-right conspiracies on social media, much of the hate and much of the racism has been mainstreamed and it's been justified using the same kind of language we heard after 9/11, you know, the terror threat, a security threat, and this myth around integration, that Muslims haven't integrated into British society and they are the enemy within. And those are the narratives that have emboldened the racist thugs to carry out the violence that we've seen over the summer.
Michael, would you say you agree with that, that this kind of atmosphere of hate has been building for many, many years?
It has been brewing for many, many years. But not only that, we fail to call out not just the characteristics, but how we can actually deal with racism. Now, the fact is, Dr. Tony Sewell in 2021, he chaired the report for the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. This, I think, would have been a clear shot across the bows to say, okay, let's recognize that we do have an issue. Let's recognize that we do have a problem. And here is how we can actually lay down the framework in which we will establish to deal with this. But no, Dr. Sewell, in chairing that, and I have to say, just so that there isn't a gotcha moment, Dr. Tony Sewell is an ex-mentor of mine. When I started out at The Voice, he was very, very helpful in shepherding me towards basically ethical journalism. But it seems like ethical journalism wasn't at play here because he played down our lived experience of racism and how ingrained institutional racism is in our society. And I think that's half the problem. The denial, the continual denial, the walking past the elephant in the room and not actually addressing it. It's one thing to actually say it doesn't exist, but then to double down on that by papering over the cracks with a report which was designed to highlight what the issues were is a travesty.
Ash, do you agree that this far-right, these ideas that used to belong to a niche part of the political discourse are now mainstream, and how dangerous is that?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that there has been a long process of conveyor belting ideas and discourse from the far right into the very heart of mainstream politics. And actually, you can trace this all the way back to 1968 with Enoch Powell's infamous Rivers of Blood speech, where he essentially predicted demographic civil war breaking out because of the immigration of people of colour from Commonwealth countries. Now, while Powell was forced to resign in disgrace, those ideas that he expressed as a Conservative Party frontbencher became mainstream ideas amongst the British Conservative Party and indeed filtered their way into the British Labour Party. So then if you fast forward to the early 2000s under Tony Blair's Labour government, there was a shared project, shall we say, between right-wing tabloid newspapers, the far right, like the British National Party, and the Labour government themselves to demonise asylum seekers. You had, in the Sun and the News of the World, Asylum Week, which covered the asylum issue in the most grotesquely racist of terms. So for a really, really long time, you have had this circle between far-right discourses and ideas around race and migration, the positioning of far-right parties, and the response coming from the very heart of power, from the Conservative and from the Labour parties. So what we've seen, just a few weeks ago, I would love nothing more than to say this is an aberration, this is a one-off, this doesn't say anything about British politics. In fact, it says an awful lot about British politics, and the fact that politicians and newspapers think that there is an incentive to beat down on asylum seekers, Muslims, and minorities in general.
It's a very
What I think,
bleak.
though, is that there should be
It's a very bleak
a
picture. Sorry,
recognition
Michael,
that-
go ahead.
I was about to say that there should be a recognition that there are some positives which have come out of this. There is no longer this gaslighting notion that racism doesn't exist, that this is something that, you know, other countries actually go through. There is no way that the continual gaslighting can actually be perpetuated, because we've seen it with our own eyes. We've seen brown people being attacked. We've seen black people being attacked because of the very color of their skin. So this ongoing, or this attempt to continue this narrative that racism does not exist, cannot exist, because we've seen evidence of it.
It's all very interesting, and I want to bring attention to one element here, which is the element of social media and the online world, and how much weight that has had in the conversation here. Because, Ash, you mentioned civil war, and it's funny that you mentioned that, because so much of what was happening in the streets mirrored conversations online. And an unexpected voice weighed in on the debate: tech billionaire Elon Musk. It all started with this tweet that read, WTF is happening in the UK. As a response, the effects of mass migration and open borders is what's going on. To what Musk added, civil war is inevitable. Michael, Musk has repeatedly prophesied this future civil war related to immigration. And while this is unheard of for a corporate executive speaking in public, the prediction of a civil war has become a frequent talking point among some far-right activists who view a civil war in Europe as not only unavoidable, but also as something to be welcomed.
You can't really get away from the fact that Elon Musk is an agitator. Elon Musk, in the purest form, thrives on agitation. His platform, in terms of pushing an algorithm, will push negative views to you and not positive ones. So all he's doing is providing a catalyst by which the likes of Nigel Farage, Tommy Robinson, and Lawrence Fox can actually amplify. And if you look at these three agitators in particular, they were instrumental in fanning the flames of the riots. And it's interesting. It's interesting that, you know, I hear the focus and I see the focus on Musk, but let's call out our homegrown agitators, our homegrown amplifiers, and call them for what they are. They are instrumental and part and parcel of why the flames were actually fanned. And you talk about civil war. Now, let's just face it, if this was a civil war, well, the far right lost.
Taj, the UK government has condemned that post by Musk and said he could be punished. Your thoughts on precisely what Michael was saying, the responsibility of Musk, but also of social media. Should people like Musk and other prominent agitators be punished? Should all those perceived to be spreading hatred, racism, misinformation be held to account?
I think misinformation on social media is one of the biggest issues that we have in society in general. And as much as they were fanning the flames of bigotry and spreading outright lies, they were also provoking fear and trying to provoke a reaction. So there was one list of locations where the far right were apparently going to march, and this was circulated on Telegram groups. And it meant that a lot of people closed their businesses early, that you had a lot of people in fear, you had a lot of people organizing to confront the racists. And this was a tactic that the British National Party used many, many years ago. Look, I think if you are inciting violence, and we've seen people inciting violence on social media, pointing out targets like mosques and local businesses, I think you should face prosecution for inciting violence. I don't think we should police speech necessarily. I think we do need to have debate and discussion, and that's important. But far too often we are told that legitimate concerns, we always hear this narrative that these people have legitimate concerns, but I'm sorry, if you're desecrating graves and you're targeting mosques and you're punching hijab wearing women in the face, that's not legitimate concerns, that's violence, and that needs to be called out. So I think we definitely need to look at social media, because during those riots there were so many accounts on Twitter, for instance, now known as X, where you had blue ticks. And when you looked at these accounts, they weren't even based in the UK, and yet they were agitating and being amplified. And I think that seriously provoked the flames of what we've seen in the last couple of weeks.
I want to play devil's advocate here, and Michael, then I'll get your reaction to something, because many people have been talking about how worried they are that this will actually give the UK government an argument to take law enforcement even further. Let's take a look.
Org is one of 27 campaign groups that has written to Sir Keir Starmer, urging them not to expand the use of live facial recognition technology in response to the recent riots. This is something that the government is proposing to do, and in doing so, they will expand the UK's digital surveillance state. We used to worry about ID cards in the past, how they'd be used to track people. Now in the future, it's going to be your face that is being tracked as you walk down the high street or walk through train stations and the like, creating a mass network of digital surveillance across the UK. This is a form of digital authoritarianism. Actually, in Europe, this type of technology is already being restricted to only the most serious cases, such as tracking down missing people or in response to a live terrorist threat. Yet there's no such legal basis that restricts its use in the UK. That needs to change. Yes, the riots were very serious and they needed a proper police response, but we don't need a knee-jerk authoritarian digital surveillance state here in the UK.
Michael, your thoughts here on harsher sentences, more surveillance. Is that the answer?
Definitely isn't the answer. It's a Trojan horse by which the police and the state are actually using to introduce these draconian powers. It's interesting, just going back to the point that was made about legitimate concerns. Where was the legitimate concerns when Lucy Letby killed and killed again several children? That didn't actually lead to rioting. Where was the legitimate concern there? Where was the legitimate concern when on the 22nd of August, Olivia Pratt-Corbell, a 9-year-old girl, was actually shot by Thomas Cashman in 2022? Where was the legitimate concern there? I do feel as though this creep of a police state has been ratcheted up since we were trying to kill the bill. Campaigners will know that this was always going to be the end game for them. And draconian powers are no longer the thing of Orwellian nightmares. They are basically our reality.
So where to from now? Absolutely, Ash. I want your take here on where to from now. I mean, how are people feeling right now? Michael pointed out the fact that there is something positive about this. There's no denying that racism is there, is present. It's part of the political discourse. It's part of the media coverage. But how do you go on about building your life in a country that you've always called home when you know that there's so many people out there that think some horrendous things about you and don't see you as part of their own world?
Well, look, I'll put it this way. Talk is very cheap. It's policy and spending commitments which matter. I may be at odds with some of my fellow panelists here. Maybe they agree with me, but I believe quite strongly that the people who are out there rioting and committing heinous acts of racial hatred, many of them were victims as well as perpetrators. Now, what were they victims of? Victims of austerity, victims of deindustrialization, victims of rubbish housing, victims of a chronic lack of opportunity, and also victims of a racist political and media culture which offered up minorities, offered up Muslims, and offered up migrants.
They're the victims of the very same woes that some of the people that they have been accusing of taking their place are. They share the same problems.
Exactly. And I think this is such an important point to make. 7 out of 10 of the most deprived areas in England witnessed rioting. Now, the other 3, I imagine, are in London, which is very diverse, which is why there wasn't rioting. 7 out of 10. When you look at the sentencing of many rioters, yes, you do see people in what you would consider respectable occupations, tradespeople, scaffolders, plumbers, electricians. You also see an awful lot of people with multiple convictions and who are of no fixed abode, right? For all intents and purposes, they're homeless. They've got nothing to hope for, nothing to aim for. And so if within that context of deprivation, inequality, and lack of opportunity, you open up the the newspapers, and every single day you see something bad about Muslims, you see something bad about asylum seekers, you see something bad about migrants, you're being told that these people are an existential threat to you and to your society, and you don't have that sort of sense that abiding by the law is going to do anything good for you, well, of course you'll riot. That's something which makes complete sense within that worldview. And so if we're going to talk about what's next, it isn't actually my experience as a minority, which I think of as the number one most important thing. In fact, you meet my fears as a minority and you address my fears as a minority if you deal with those problems of regional inequality, of lack of opportunity, of deprivation, and a political culture which tries to compensate for its failures when it comes to working class people in this country by scapegoating minorities.
Very important points. Taj, what do you think should happen right now, in the next few weeks, in the next few months, to start addressing some of the issues that we saw laid bare in the last few weeks?
Well, I think firstly, Ash is spot on that, many of these places are some of the most deprived parts of the country. So as much as we have to resist racism and not appease far-right narratives around immigration and Muslims and ethnic minority communities, who, by the way, are disproportionately working class, they live in places like Birmingham, Bradford, Luton, which have very similar economic problems to places like Sunderland and Hull and other parts where we've seen rioting. So we have to find a way to try and unite communities. I think a lot of the people involved in the rioting were children. They've been radicalized by what they're seeing on TikTok and what they're seeing on social media. And there is very little opportunity in many of these communities. So as much as we have to resist far-right narratives, and I think it's important that we build a campaign that is very unapologetic about resisting racism, equally, we have to address material needs in these communities. I don't think the government is proposing that at the moment. I don't think prosecution is going to deal with the atmosphere of hate that has been created. And my fear is that we are still going to see isolated attacks on particularly hijab-wearing women and people that they often identify as being visibly different. So we have to address the atmosphere of hate. And I think the only way we can do that is by coupling race and class. These things are not in opposition to each other. Often they intersect.
Michael, your take on the future here. Where do we even begin in terms of restoring trust and rebuilding community? Is that even possible? Yours is the final answer in the show. So take me to the future, Michael.
The future is being honest and open, and we have a present government who has a problem with racism, even within its own party. So how can it deal with racism in society at large when it won't even address racism within its own party? We've had, let's take, for example, policing. Institutional racism has been identified within the police, but yet they want to paper over the cracks. They don't want to deal with that. We've had a whole report. We've had several reports, in fact, that time and time again have said the same thing. But there is an almost cyclical nature to this, in that the problem of race, the problem of racism, continues to be pushed by the wayside. And it's until we have the guts, until we have the, I suppose, future looking, if we are looking to better society, and, the ambition to deal with racism full stop, that's when we'll get progress. But if we continue to skirt, if we continue to push past reports upon reports upon reports, we're going to be in exactly the same situation, same place. And this is going to be a cyclical occurrence.
It definitely takes guts. It definitely takes courage, but the results should be a better, more just society. Ash, Taj, and Michael, thank you so much for being part of the stream today. Thank you for having this conversation. And thank you all for watching. If you have a comment about our show, you can always talk to us on social media. You can send us your questions and suggestions using the hashtag or the handle AJStream. Take care, and I'll see you soon.